So before I begin, I also wanted to say thank you to everyone here for just taking some time to support us. We've been working for a couple of months now, and yeah, having your ears and eyes is really nice. So I appreciate that. Okay, so who am I? Well, first of all, I think the most important part about who I am is the fact that I'm a woman and I'm a woman of color. And it's important because that impacts my life experience in the world, and therefore that impacts the work that I'm about to show you. And so I put that at the top of the list. In the middle of this year, I walked across a digital stage, graduating from Ryerson. I got a degree in languages and intercultural relations, and during that time, I was able to study Spanish and Mandarin at the same time, which was super fun. I also studied a fair bit of anthropological theory during that degree with some really talented professors. And they taught me how to critically think about the world around us, right to that micro level of how we use language or how symbols are used to actually negotiate someone's position in the world. And that influenced my project as well. I love creative writing. I love prose and poetry, as well as social commentary and research papers. I also got a chance, due to a lot of spare time I had in 2020, like a lot of you, to explore some of my artistic passions, which include painting. And for the past 9 years, I've actually been working in coffee shops while balancing school or just other things in my 20s. However, about a month ago, I actually left coffee and started my first corporate 9 to 5 job in market research. So I'm no longer a barista. I now work as a project manager for a firm. And that transition has been tough, but also you can't tell right now if I'm wearing sweatpants or not, so it's not that tough. And finally, I'm one of Shujat's mentees. And I think now that this project is done, that makes me a designer, I think. So, with my experience in coffee, I've always felt like neighborhood coffee shops are a really good barometer for how a community is doing, especially when I was working in a coffee shop during the pandemic. And so my problem is actually shaped by my personal experience as a woman of color working in a coffee shop here in Toronto, and at the same time studying topics like power, language, inequality, race, symbolism. And so this perspective that I had was really nuanced, and it gave me the opportunity to ask questions about how identity and power were actually negotiated within that small world of specialty coffee, but also how that related to the performances of knowledge that I observed outside of the coffee shop, just in the real world. Big question. Turns out I actually spent the past couple of years already gathering field notes and writing about this topic in university across like 3 different courses that I took. So I already had a lot of material to work with. Unfortunately, that material was in the form of a traditional research paper, like a Word document or a PDF, which had the potential for some really important discourse, but just wasn't very digestible. For those in academia, this kind of format is really familiar, but I think for everyone else, this design just isn't really, I think that the design of this is actually part of the problem. And so this introduces kind of a new problem of how to design this material. The problem that I was discussing was essentially translating a research paper that I spent a couple of years writing into something that felt more approachable and accessible for a platform that felt familiar. And I mentioned that for those of you who know me personally, that I kind of fell out of love with academia in my last year of university. Just kind of realizing that as an institution, there are some real problems like any other institution. However, my passion for research and education and writing was something that hasn't really changed. And so I wanted to be able to keep the parts that I like and remove the rest, I guess. So the first thing I did was look at, my idea was to essentially make a mock coffee roaster site. And instead of selling coffee, I would have coffee cards that linked to different aspects of my research, where you would have like a coffee bag for sale. And so I went to this Pilot Coffee Roasters website for inspiration, and drew out kind of what I thought my version of that would be, which looks fairly similar. I think I tried to make it different and funky by having pentagon cards instead of rectangle ones, but really everything was quite safe and traditional here. And while that was happening, Shuja and I actually had some one-on-one sessions with one another to learn Figma. So I should mention that my design background prior to this mentorship is completely zero. And so I had never downloaded Figma before. I've not had experience on it. And so we actually created, like, what we did is he would do something and then I would copy him, and then he would create the next card and then I would copy him. And that's kind of how I learned how to make a search bar and cards and titles and subtitles. And then after I did the basics with Shujat, I thought about this kind of layout and I liked the rectangle cards. But as you can tell from my sketch from before, I was doing some funky things with shapes and I felt like, I could change it up. So one thing led to another, and I decided to play around with triangles. So I'm going to show you this video and then I'll explain what's going on here. I liked the idea of triangles, just one at first, and then one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew, everything was triangles. And I liked, there were parts of it that I liked. In terms of the name of my project, Doxa, if you look at the X symbol in the word Doxa, it's really just two triangles. And I think I just hyper focused on this concept and did not understand anything other than triangles. And so this is what came of that. After having a little chat with Shujat, we decided it was time to regroup and actually pivot the project away from the triangular form that it took. And so we went back to the name. We revisited the meaning of the name, which is Doxa Coffee Roasters. And now I'll actually go into the naming of the project. I think it's more important at this point because this is where I started to really focus on the meaning and bringing that about in my design. So Doxa is a Greek word. It means common belief or opinion. And although my research is not common belief or opinion, it's about things like that. It's about things that are taken for granted and we don't talk about out loud because they're just unquestioned truths. So essentially, Doxa is kind of like the opposite of discourse. And in 2020, in particular, there was a lot of information and subject matter that was Doxa that got shifted into discourse after what happened with George Floyd. A lot of this conversation became up into like a conscious place for most people. The word itself was actually coined by sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And I found the best way to describe it is in his quote here, where he says, Doxa is that which goes without saying because it comes without saying. It's just what we know, but we don't talk about it until we do. So now that I had kind of a new, now that I let go of that triangles thing and I focused in on what I wanted to focus in on, I decided to find a new type of inspiration. These are some of the inspirations I had in terms of print. I really liked the colors of a newspaper or like a book. This kind of these like examples reminded me of something that was classically academic looking. I really liked the use of headers and subheaders to guide the eye in terms of information, but still it was visually interesting to look at. It was approachable. And then I moved on to looking at some web inspiration for the project. So again, kind of looking at like a simple editorial style, but that combines, different types of typefaces, sort of looks like a bit of a newspaper with that header at the top. And I also really liked the use, especially in this one in the front here, the use of bubbles for article tags. I just like the rounded edges in contrast to something that was more kind of square. And I think that's what I wanted in terms of introducing an interesting shape for the eye. Finally, we looked into typography exploration. So once we had the name, we wanted to look for different ways to design the header, especially because at this point I realized that I wanted a big, bold header, but I also wanted it to be something that was clean and looked professional, not necessarily academic, but just clean. Um, I also wanted it to be able to, it was really important to me that that X in Doxa still kind of stayed in that shape and there wasn't too much complications, because I think there was a part of my heart that wanted triangles and that it was just tiny ones. If you think about it, there's 4 triangles and an X. That is more than enough for this project. So at this point, I felt like I had a pretty good idea of like all the pieces I wanted, but absolutely nowhere to begin. I kind of was experiencing that experience where you're looking at a blank page and you just like feel kind of helpless, because as much as I knew about Figma, I just like didn't know where to even begin. And so Shuja really helped ease that panic, honestly, by creating a template here for me to just be able to start to play around with something on the page. And so I think that's really the story of how I came to what is now my final project. So I'll introduce to you Doxa Coffee Roasters. So this is the landing page. As you can see, like I said before, there's a really big, bold header, just like a newspaper. We decided on the subheader or the little tagline, sorry, pretty early. It's a place to roast everything coffee, which is exactly what I wanted it to be. This is also the way that I approached making my research approachable and setting a tone pretty much immediately from the beginning, which is a tone of satire. I think humor can be a great tool for learning and something that isn't often used in academia. And I wanted to be able to challenge having something be so serious, because it doesn't always need to be. So the landing page features 2 big main cards. You can kind of starting to play with face a little bit here. I really wanted to combine something that looked more formal and traditional, like the main titles, with something that was more modern and just something you don't really see in textbooks or in papers, which is what you see inside of the bubble article tags, as well as the subtitle or subheader, the little information underneath there. And like I said earlier, the point of this entire research project is really to move the subject matter that I'm talking about from a state of doxa, which is things we don't talk about, to a state of discourse. And so here, really, that's highlighting that. And in particular, we're highlighting the word discourse by changing the type, which I really liked that detail personally. So moving forward down the landing page here, we've got some articles, which you'll see on the next page. I'm also featuring the, still continuing with that same bubble article tag, and then some images. And then finally, to frame the bottom of the page, we bring the name of the project back, as well as the tagline, because we want to remind them where they're at. And I also like that it's small, but it's still quite bold, which is important to me. So this is my articles page. Again, kind of repeating that same editorial style. My Figma basics training was in full action here. Sans the triangles, but more bubble tags and more combinations of using that formal font. I really liked using a formal font or formal typeface to write some of the more hilarious article titles. I think there's something about that really lends itself to the satire of the piece. And there's a little bit of practice on content design here too, which I've found that I quite enjoy. So just scrolling over here, you can see there's the 2 main cards from the landing page again at the bottom there. And this would probably be my favorite part of the piece. This is the big article. So this is the redesign of the research article that I showed you at the beginning, the text body, into something that I hope would be more accessible and approachable. As you can see, I'm starting to explore adding images, adding bigger amounts of text, and also I'm actually going to go back. You can see that we're combining again the formal typeface with underneath it something less formal and more and less like academic, but still kind of making them work with one another. So this research paper, essentially when I started the research, I was looking at what it means to be a barista. I was performing an ethnography, which means I was essentially doing a research project into my own community. And so I would take field notes and do interviews and collect information about what it meant to be a barista and what that meant in terms of how do you know you're a barista. I learned that there's two main ways. You can either gain technical knowledge by like actually making coffees and knowing all of the, parts of a machine, but there's also the talk. You have to be able to talk the talk, because if you don't know how to talk about what you're doing, no one really knows. And so performance, I learned, was a really big part of identity. So that kind of comes up here in my chapter 1. You can see that I've kind of used the headings and the subheadings inspiration from before, so it kind of feels like you're reading a book. And I've also continued to use mixed fonts to pay homage to what's traditional, but also to continue exploring a new type of academic writing. So I learned that when you are trying to determine your identity, because part of your identity is performed as a barista, it means that the people around you have an effect on how you are placed, and that perhaps being a barista isn't as simple as you are one or you aren't one, but perhaps there's a gradient of what type of barista you can be. And within that gradient, there are stratified identities of master barista or not so good barista who works at Second Cup or Tim Hortons. And within that, I understood that within negotiations happening between all these different types of baristas as to who was better and why, and who could gain social mobility by performing what type of knowledge. The research project itself at the coffee stage was just very rich in data. But I started to notice that the information that I was learning was actually, there was a bit of a shift where I realized I wasn't just writing about performance of baristaship or connoisseurship anymore. I was writing about the performance of anything, because we all ask ourselves who we are, and to some extent, who we are is about how we perform who we are. And so you can see here that I've kind of started to I've changed the way that my information is laid out with this quote. So normally in research papers, when you find a quote that perfectly supports your research, you're super, super, super happy. And then you have to like embed it into your paper and hope that it's not skimmed over. In this case, I actually had the choice to just be like, no, I love this quote. I love Pierre Bourdieu. He has taught me a lot and he deserves a space to shine. So we let him have his stage here, using some underlining to really bring home that maybe this is about more than just baristas, it's about social identity. And so this is where I introduce the shift in my research to become more about identity in general, as I noticed this kind of mirroring effect in other identity performances. Working in a coffee shop in Toronto, especially specialty third wave coffee, one of the groups that I noticed this with the most was within people who are white identifying and also are woke identifying. So that is kind of mirrored here with the way that the heading is actually, it's a mirror of the heading above, the barista heading. And again, it's this idea of like, if you are woke as a white person, that is your identity. But within the identity of white individuals, it's stratified. Wokeness could mean many things. And in fact, I noticed through my research, once I opened up my field notes to start to listen into conversations about wokeness, that everyone identified wokeness differently, and that technical knowledge and performance of wokeness or allyship was, again, something that was determined by a group. And so similarly to barista identity, I think that the identity of allyship was something that became stratified and was very interesting to witness and write about as a way of sorting through who's more superior and who's well read and who's a better ally. I mean, we still have these conversations today. And so here's a little bit more of that body of text. I've also included quotes, just kind of to help draw the eye in for important bits, but not as important as a quote by Mr. Bordeaux, but Dr. Bordeaux, I should say. But still having the eye drawn in at some important bits here was important for me. And here's the end of the piece with, of course, one more shining moment for our main man. And then a button that we designed at the bottom there for the full study, because the original article is actually pages and pages longer than this. And I think that, again, if something is accessible, you kind of can have like a summary, but if people want to read more, it's there, of course. And so we decided not to have it be like an entire thing. So then we moved on and designed an image-heavy article, which is this one here. This article was actually not featured very heavily in my research. It was like one tiny paragraph, so it was fun to think about what I wanted to do with this. I decided to go back to the original idea of having the two main cards. This time there's no like title, it's just the pictures, but I tried to pick pictures that I think would represent the article well. This article in particular is about, it talks about tasting notes on coffee bags and how sometimes the language that's used on coffee bags can actually gatekeep who that coffee is meant for. The enemy or the villain in this situation I chose was the word stone fruit. Not my favorite word because I don't think it's very accessible to people who don't know what stone fruit is. And I think that using plum or apricot is perfectly fine. But I think that these words are used for a reason. And I discussed this in a bit of a storytelling, more creative way in this article with my own experience going through having someone describe or tell me that I'm describing coffee incorrectly by not using the right words. We inserted a photo there and a quote, again, by you know who, to kind of keep this, because this was meant to be an image-heavy article, I wanted to keep it fairly low on the text. And then we included a great example of a company here in Toronto that's actually breaking this pattern of gatekeeping in specialty coffee by using words for tasting notes that are accessible to everyone. So this would be one of their Ethiopian roasts. And they've used tasting notes, fuzzy peaches and cherry cola, which sounds delicious. And then finally, one more. So this article just features 2 text body paragraphs. And then again, that option to be able to download the full study if you actually want to go into more. So here is the mobile version of what Doxa Coffee Roasters would look like. Again, this is just the text-heavy article, but we're still keeping the same formatting and the same typeface sort of mixed effect there. And then there's the first, the first page of the, or the first look at the image-heavy article. So my takeaways from participating in Super Session. I think the first one was that there are so many aspects of design that I wasn't aware of. I have people in my life who I know are designers, and I never really knew what that word meant. But similar to my research, I learned that design is a stratified identity. There's a gradient, and you just find your place on that gradient. And maybe I'm still finding mine. I'm not sure. I also learned that design is collaborative. Because it's a stratified identity, it's great to have a team of people with different skills and interests. I also learned knowing when to pivot and knowing when to let go is also important. Those were 2 things that I experienced in the middle of my project when I really had to think about what I was doing and kind of start from the beginning again. In general, a takeaway for design, I think, would be that the medium is the message, because although the information I'm putting right here on Doxa Coffee is the same information I had in my paper. Even for me, telling the story in this way feels like I can, even as the person who wrote it, I understand it better, and that's probably because I participated in both versions, but that's just my opinion. And number 5, I think I learned more about identity, not just about being a barista or being woke, definitely not about being white, but maybe about being a designer and where my place is, like I said, on that gradient. So next steps for me include trying to find a new way to introduce an intersection between writing, research, design. I think that Shujat and I talked about content design as an option for me, and I'm really excited to explore that. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you guys for your ears and eyes.